Very soon after starting out on our liveaboard diving trip recently, it became clear to all that we were not going to make it to the Brother Islands in the central Red Sea, which was in fact our main destination. The wind was up, and crossing the open sea for such a distance would have been dangerous, and so a decision was made to stay in the area around the southern Sinai Peninsula and to dive the numerous sites around there. On the second day, our dive master Carl Prinsloo told us that we would be diving to the wreck of the Thistlegorm, probably the best known wreck in that area, and arguably the most famous diveable wreck in the world. Thistlegorm was sunk near Ras Mohammed in October 1941 by two German bombers only a year after its maiden voyage. It lies near Shag Rock off the west coast of the Sinai Peninsula at a maximum depth of 33 meters. The French explorer Jacques Cousteau discovered the wreck 14 years later, in 1955, and the following year National Geographic magazine published an article about it. However, Cousteau did not reveal the ship's position, and again for almost 20 years Thistlegorm passed into obscurity. It was located again in 1974, but its location was kept secret until 1992, when a group of divers accidentally came across it, and soon afterwards its location was published as a dive site. Why is this wreck so unique? Well, Thistlegorm was a huge cargo vessel loaded to the maximum with supplies intended for the relief of Tobruk. Its holds were crammed with trucks, motorbikes, ammunition, aeroplane spares and rifles, and it carried two sets of railway locomotives as deck cargo. It sank almost completely intact, except for the area where the two German bombs hit the ammunition magazine, triggering a massive explosion that broke off the stern and sent the ship to the sea bottom. Today, most of Thistlegorm's cargo is completely intact as on the day it sank. Of course, some things have eroded away, but its holds are full of trucks, neatly parked, motorbikes, tires and everything else it was carrying. And this is what draws divers to this place over and over, to swim through its holes and pass into another time. Thistlegorm is a time capsule of the world at its worst and most destructive, at the height of the Second World War. Early that morning, we found ourselves moored along several other diving boats. These boats and our own were literally tied off on the wreck. Then we were on our way down. We had planned two dives. The first would be around the outside of the wreck as orientation of its layout. The second dive, planned for later that same day, would be into the wreck itself, penetrating the various holds. The current came head-on and was quite strong. Operating my camera required both hands, so I couldn't use the rope. On the wreck was less current, but the visibility was not good. Also, I had decided not to use my camera lights on this dive. I wanted to save the batteries for the second dive inside the wreck, when I would require lights all the time. I followed Dennis and Reg Scully across the deck to the port side. We wanted to reach a steam engine which had been blown off the ship by the explosion. It lay some 20 meters from the wreck. When we eventually got there, it was clear that the murky water was going to prevent me from getting clear, wide shots. The Thistlegorm belonged to the Elben Line, which was a commercial company. So, apart from its military cargo, it also carried two sets of rolling stock for delivery to the Egyptian railways, each consisting of a railway engine, a tender and a water carrier. Remarkably, this engine landed upright. Only as recently as 2002, a local diver found the other steam engine on the other side of the wreck, still attached to part of the deck and the ship's funnel. It had been flung more than 150 meters through the air by the explosion. Here, between the steam engine and the wreck, was a massive debris field where all the fragments that had been blown into the sky landed and lay scattered everywhere. Here was nothing but chaos. I soon lost the other divers and was on my own, exploring the seabed and trying to make sense of all the bits and pieces. There were unexploded shells and ammunition boxes that had spilt out of the magazine when the explosion ripped it open. These lay scattered everywhere, undisturbed since it landed there 65 years ago. This ship was carrying huge quantities of ammunition of all sorts, all of it essential supplies for the 8th Army fighting in North Africa. I couldn't help wondering at some point how many lives have been spared by the sinking of the Thistlegorm. I was now near the stern, looming over me like a huge building. This section had broken off from the main wreck. It was here that I found Dennis King, doing what he always does best. It was from the gaping hole that broke the ship in two that much of the cargo spilt out and lay everywhere, giving just a small insight into the massive consumption of materials that went into the war effort. There were rolls and rolls of wire everywhere. At times it was hard to discern what I was looking at. Everything was twisted and broken. The remains of some trucks lay intertwined with other fragments of the ship. The only recognizable parts were the wheels. The stern of the ship lay canted at 45 degrees. Although much destruction was evident here, this section was largely intact and features a 40mm anti-aircraft machine gun, now pointing at the seabed. I would have liked to have used lights here, to lift out some of the fabulous colors of these soft corals, but I needed the batteries full for the second dive later on. It was here that I found a fish I desperately wanted video of, the Arabian smoke angelfish. It's endemic to the Red Sea and quite rare, and this is the only shot I ever got of it. As it swam off into the distance, I was left to contemplate the perspective of a wreck lying at an angle, all broken and twisted. I had a strong sense of loss, of tragedy and of waste. It's exactly these strong emotions that draw divers to wrecks. This is where we can cross that elusive interface between what is and what was. I was drawn back to the anti-aircraft gun. Even now, after 65 years of silence, it still exudes an air of threat. But when I saw the coral taking hold on the barrel, I realized that this gun, like the ship it once protected, and like all other wrecks, was condemned to decay and obliteration. I began making my way back to the midship area and swam over the section where the magazine exploded. Nowhere else was the devastating force of the explosion more evident than here. 3-centimeter steel plates were crumpled and ripped like paper. At the time of the attack on Thistlegorm, the ship, with its valuable cargo, had been lying at anchor for a full 2 weeks because the Suez Canal had been blocked. German intelligence received information that a large troop ship, possibly the Queen Mary, carrying 1,200 troops, was in the area of the Gulf of Suez. 2 Heinkel bombers of a squadron based in Crete was dispatched to seek and destroy. On the 5th of October 1941, just before 11 o'clock at night, they crossed the North Egyptian coast heading southeast down the Gulf of Suez. They searched in vain. It was a clear, moonlit night. Just when their fuel levels became critical and they were about to turn back, they spotted a ship at anchor. One of the planes came in low over the sea and released 2 bombs right over the ship's bridge. Both bombs penetrated the magazine, detonating a great deal of ammunition. The explosion sent the 2 locomotives flying into the air as the ship was ripped open like a huge tin can. The ship began sinking very fast. There was no time to launch lifeboats, and the crew simply leapt straight into the sea. At 1:30 in the morning, it disappeared beneath the waves. Of the 48 crew on board, 9 perished, making this ship an official war grave. Once back on board our diving boat, I studied some documentation about the Thistlegorm's cargo. A large part of this cargo consisted of small trucks of various kinds. There were 2 types of Fords, some Bedford trucks, several of the smaller Morris commercial CS8s, and 1 Tilling Stevens truck. These were mostly in hold number 2. An interesting part of the Thistlegorm's cargo was the large number of motorcycles it was carrying. There were BSAs, the matchless G3L, and Norton 16s. These were all solid motorcycles made for riding in the desert. They were intended both for convoy outriders and for carrying dispatches and documents. At about 5 that afternoon, we started on the second dive. On arriving at the wreck, we were met by a large turtle sheltering from the current behind some wreckage. With him was a yellow bar angelfish. Carl led the way through a small door to the interior of the ship. This was the part I was looking forward to most, getting inside the ship. We were a group of about 12 divers, and we had all agreed that I would follow directly after Carl to get clean views for the video. Carl dropped through a hole in the floor to one of the holds deeper in the ship. We would start deep and work our way up. I followed him in. There was a lot of suspended sediment in the water, kicked up by other divers. This was causing backscatter problems from my camera lights, but if I turned the lights off, I wouldn't be able to see where I was going. We eventually entered one of the holds, and here came across some trucks. One of them carried a load of gumboots. Here was the first evidence of the human element of Thistlegorm's story. The backs of most trucks were loaded with cargo, motorbikes, and something I thought was an ammunition trailer, or might have been a water carrier of which the tank had rusted away. The canvas and woodwork on the trucks had long before disintegrated. Only frames were left. Most of the cabs still had their windscreens and side windows intact, but the steering wheels and other controls were gone. These circular objects were cowlings and other fittings for radial aeroplane engines. We entered another hold. Here were more trucks. There was a peculiar order about everything. The trucks were still neatly parked, as if done only yesterday, and they all still had their spare wheels in place under the rear floor, but the floorboards had long gone.